Good morning. The recently concluded 16th BRICS summit in Russia drew a lot of global attention. Another event on the sideline of the summit, which was of great interest to the world, was the bilateral meeting after a gap of 5 years between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Now, what I'll do in the video is I will first explain the foundational association that India has with BRICS. And then I will explain that India has great opportunities to derive a lot of benefits because of that foundational agreement, something it is not willing to do. So let me start by explaining the foundational association that India has with BRICS first. So the first date that comes to mind, or the year, is 1999. Now this is the year when in America the Clinton administration was in power and the first tranche of NATO expansion to the east happened. Now the Russian foreign minister at that time was Primakov, a wise man who was well ahead of his time. He could foresee that after this first tranche of expansion, where three countries, Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic, were included in NATO, where exactly was it going? He was very unhappy with the unipolar world and he wanted to create a multipolar world. Not now, but he was looking ahead. So at that time, Russia had very good relations with India and Russia had good relations with China. Three big countries at that time. So Primakov, he had informally been discussing with his colleagues both in India and Russia about a possibility of the three countries working together. That means RIC umbrella, Russia, India, China. Working in the sense that it is for mutual benefit, for mutual gains, with mutual respect and with no interference in each other's internal affairs. So the idea was good. So it was accepted by India and China, which also had good relations with one another. But unlike Russia, because after all Primakov had seen the bipolar world. He understood great power politics. So he was looking in this RIC, great geopolitics or great power politics in the years ahead. This is something that India and China at that time were not looking at. They were oblivious to this. Now the next date, which is important, is 2001. Now this year, an economist of the Goldman Sachs, he came up with the theory that there are four fast emerging economies in the world. And they are Brazil, Russia, India, China. If they were to work together, then by the year 2050, they would dominate the global economy. Now, this is the time when the economy of India and China, it was matched. So there was no competition, nothing in 2001. But the Chinese immediately sensed the importance of this research because Chinese were looking at the economic rise of China because in that they saw great power status for China. So they were looking at geoeconomics and not geopolitics like the Russians. So in December of 2001, when China was admitted into the WTO, we know the miracle that China did over the next 17 years. It pulled out something like 800 million people out of dire poverty, unheard of in the history of the world. But that besides, in 2001, they had the vision of economics, geoeconomics. Therefore, in the following year, in 2002, China offered a free trade agreement to the 10 ASEAN nations in the Western Pacific. Mind you, ASEAN was created by the Americans and the Brits, but it is the Chinese who understood that if they were to offer development and prosperity and trade to this grouping, they would draw it closer to China than the Americans could by just offering them security. And this idea gave results. Today, the annual trade between ASEAN nations and China is close to $1 trillion. In 2001, China was still looking ahead and they were eyeing the African continent, a continent with 54 nations. The Chinese had been working there since the 60s, but they wanted to double down now. They wanted to do more work there, work for development, work for connectivity. Once again, that is fructifying, their idea in the African continent. Today, China is the primary trading partner with the African nations. And the collective trade of the African continent with China, it stands at $290 billion annually and rising. Now, at this time, when China was thinking of global geoeconomics and the Russians were thinking of global geopolitics, India was doing no such thing. Because in the year 2001, having done the nuclear tests in 1998, the sole fixation of the Indian government was to have close relations with the Americans. So they were focused on an entirely different agenda, but they were happy to come and work together as a grouping. So this grouping was RIC, and as I said, RIC was about respecting one another, non-interference in one another, and win-win situations. Now the next year of importance is 2010. This is when South Africa was added to the BRIC and it became BRICS. It became a 5-member nation. Chinese again were looking ahead. They were thinking that why not BRICS have a bank of its own? Therefore, a bank came into being in 2015 called the BRICS Bank or the New Development Bank. Now, BRICS is the only inter-government organization in the world which has a bank of its own. And the purpose of the bank was not to confront or challenge or displace the Bretton Woods institutions created by the Americans after the Second World War. The purpose was to focus on the emerging markets and the developing countries, to help them with their projects, something that the IMF and the World Bank, they were not doing. So that was the aim, to give a bit of an add-on. And that has shown good results, we know that. So this was the year 2015. Now, if we see the date that most analysts put, when the great global geopolitics transformed, it is 2017. What that means is that what used to be a unipolar world, which came into being after the end or after the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991 until 2017, is the unipolar world. In 2017, when the Trump administration was in power in America, it is generally accepted that the world became multipolar. And the global geopolitics shifted from Europe to our region, which is Asia Pacific region, primarily for two reasons. One, the spectacular rise of China. And the second is the rise of the economies, fast growing economies in the region. For example, of the 20 economies, fast growing economies of the world, 9 are in African continent alone. So these were the two reasons, and because it became a multipolar world, now instead of one power, America, the superpower, in the unipolar world, there were 3 great powers. A great power by definition has 3 attributes. One, a great power, unlike other countries, is able to influence events anywhere in the world. Second, a great power does not have a higher authority over it. That means there is no nation, no higher authority that can coerce a great power to change its policy or its actions. And the third is, a great power by itself is capable to look after its sovereignty. So when we look at the 3 attributes, there were only 3 nations which came in this category, and they are America, China and Russia. So 3 nations, and between them they had 2 entirely different global governing systems that came into being. As far as China and Russia are concerned, they were to work together because they were the member countries of the BRICS. And that philosophy of BRICS they brought in to a governing system, a global governing system, where The talk was about connectivity, development, prosperity, multilateralism, indivisible security, equal partnership, respect for all nations, big or small, and working under the United Nations. Whether it was United Nations international law or United Nations based order, rules and order, which was not the case with the other system. The other system was led by America, and the followers were the global north nations, what we call, which are the industrialized nations of the world, west of the world, constitute about 20% of the world population. So their thinking was exactly opposite to this thinking. They talk about balance of power politics, and therefore security for them is a zero-sum game. Then there is something called a US based order. It has bypassed completely the United Nations. Then they talk about deglobalization. They talk about plurilateralism, making small groups like Quad, AUKUS. So this is that system, which is based on two big pillars, which is American military power and the strength of the US dollar and the US dollar payment system. Now, obviously, most of these nations, the emerging markets and the developing nations, what we call the global south nations, what during the Cold War used to be called the third world countries, aspiring countries, they gravitated towards the model which promised them equality and which promised them development. Now, it so happened that Xi Jinping and Putin, President Putin, they have been meeting regularly for the last 10 years, and they have managed to align their vision of connectivity and prosperity with one another. For example, Putin's vision has been of Eurasian Economic Union, Greater Eurasia, North Sea route. Then he talks about international north-south transport corridor. Now, China, because it is a much bigger economy, so it talks about the expansive Belt and Road Initiative. And then there are other concepts which Xi Jinping has brought in starting 2021, which are called the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, and the Global Artificial Intelligence Governance Initiative. Now, you see, when you understand all these acronyms which have been brought in by China, by Xi Jinping, you realize that they all carry the spirit of BRICS, the spirit of equality, the spirit of indivisible security. So it is a completely different ballgame. And all these global south nations which want to be there, they are also aware about the economic strength of China. And that is that today China is the largest manufacturing nation in the world. Of the 193 nations in the world, something like 149 nations are its primary trading partners. China is the primary trading partner of those nations. And of the 10 deep sea ports in the world, 7 of them, they are in China. So the point I am making is, there is a reason why everybody gravitated towards this, and BRICS is what got the spirit of all this. This is the BRICS spirit. Now, coming to the present, this is the background. India, I'll talk of India in a while, because India has chosen to be not with the global south where it belongs, but to be with the model which is led by America. A model where we have the industrialized nations. India is a poor country, but it has decided to align with that model. Now, coming to the 16th BRICS summit, we know that there was world attention, and for right reasons, because after all, it constitutes 47% of the world population, 37% of the world economy. At this Kazan summit, there were 35 nations, there were 6 global organizations which attended, and more important, the United Nations Secretary General came there. He attended that and he spoke also there. And so did the Director General of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So they all carry the same spirit. Now, as far as this summit is concerned, it came with 10 members. And it added more. There were a lot of aspirational countries which wanted to join, but they chose and they selected 13 more countries which became partner nations, not full members yet. So what we are looking at is, we are looking at 10 full members and we are looking at 13 partner nations. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at the Kazan Declaration, the final document that came out after the summit, after 1 year presidency of Russia, where something like 200 conferences were held in various cities of Russia, you find that this is under 3 pillars. It is a total of 134 paras, huge document under 3 pillars, and the pillars are: one is the political and security pillar. It actually aligns with the global security initiative of the Chinese. The second one is on economy and finance. It aligns with the Chinese global development initiative. The third one is on culture and people to people contacts, aligns with the global civilizational initiative of the Chinese. The point is that the emerging markets and developing countries, what we call the global south, they like all this because they want to have things done respectfully under the United Nations, and which is why the Kazan Declaration, the document, it has been accepted even by the United Nations. Now, I just want to point out 5 distinctive features that I have found in the Kazan Declaration. First of all, it talks of inclusivity. Unlike the Western analysts that I have heard, it is not about, BRICS is not about building it as a counterweight to G7. No, it is not about that, because when you read the document, it talks about learning lessons from G20. It talks about reform of Bretton Woods institutions. It talks about reform of WTO. It talks about reform of United Nations. I mean, after all, Indian Foreign Minister has been saying for a long time, Jai Shankar has been saying that we want reform of the United Nations. So all this is there. It's an inclusive document because it talks about globalization. It talks about non-discrimination. It is another matter that these reforms that everybody is talking about, which have been put in the Kazan Declaration, in my assessment, they will only happen once the global geopolitics stabilizes. And when it will stabilize, I'll just explain in a while. I'll come to that. Second point, it talks about giving great importance to the original foundation RIC nation, the 3 nations, because it clearly mentions about the cooperation that these foundation nations are having with African continent, and that the lessons of their cooperation needs to be dovetailed and put together in an inclusive document. So they talk about China-Africa cooperation, it talks about India-Africa cooperation, it talks about Russia-Africa cooperation. So nobody is excluded really. The third point it talks about is digital connectivity. Here it talks about ICT, about building information technology, information and communication technology, that how the digital networks will help the countries, the developing countries, the countries of the global south. So it talks about how everything needs to be done, which is hardware and software, cyberspace connectivity needs to be built under the governance of the United Nations. That is the operating part, though we know that all the hardware that will come to these nations obviously will come from China. Because today, when we see the global geopolitics, it is being run or it is being pushed by the emerging technologies. And we see today there are 2 streams of technology. One stream is led by the Americans, the other stream is led by the Chinese. So global south, obviously majority of the nations, they will take the Chinese technology, and that will be under the under the UN governance, but the standard will be Chinese. Next, it talks about taking this digital ecosystem network to the next level, which is artificial intelligence industries. Here again it talks about data security, how it is to be done, and how all the nations need to come together and discuss this. So it talks about basically inclusivity, that everybody needs to come. And it talks about UN role in global AI governance. And for that, voluntarily, the document mentions that the BRICS has instituted what is called the BRICS Institute of Future Network Study Group on Artificial Intelligence, where the countries can come together and discuss governance, how the governance of artificial intelligence architecture is to be done. As far as the architecture is concerned, it is very clear it will come from China, because the Chinese are already experimenting with what is called the computer power corridor in their country. The whole idea is to connect the prosperous coastal areas of China with the western Gobi Desert, which is not prosperous, and even to Tibet. So the idea is that how to take over long distances, large capacities, data transmission and fast computing where the latency is not there. And when you do it over fast distances and you are able to bring high capacities, obviously at some stage, once they are validated here in their own country, they intend to take it to the BRI nations. Now, what I am saying here is that the standards of the technology will come from China, or mostly from China. But the governance, how it is to be done under the UN, that can be decided by the member states. So there is enough time to decide that. And as I said, that the emerging technologies are what underpin or what will determine the stability in the global geopolitics. So if China is able to, at whatever time, set its standards of the artificial industries, AI industries in maximum global south nations, that would be a win for China, it will be a win for the global south. I mean, after all, when we talk about 193 nations in the world and we say about 150 of them are on board the Belt and Road Initiative, we are talking of maximum countries of out of this 150, which is the global south. They would adapt or they would accept the BRI standards. Once that happens, their standards are accepted by majority of the world, then in my understanding, the global geopolitics will stabilize and the stiff competition between China and America, it will calm down. And that is when, as I said, will be the time when perhaps the reforms of United Nations and all other the Bretton Woods institutions, that is the time to do that. Because the acrimony which exists today, that would dissipate or it will lower down, the temperatures will be down. So this is the world we are looking at. Now the fifth and the final point about the Kazan Declaration is about everybody talking that they would come up with a BRICS currency. Well, of course it is not happening, certainly not in the foreseeable future. In fact, a lot of things have been said, something like there could be an bridge, there could be a BRICS pay with the blockchain technologies. I think all these things are under progress because President Putin made it very clear in his final media interaction at the end of the summit that BRICS is not looking at the alternate to the SWIFT, that the countries should do trade in national currencies. And as far as the payment system is concerned, he mentioned that they can settle it themselves. They all have their payment systems with their banks and it can be settled with that. So the point that is being made is trade in local currencies. For example, we know that it has been disclosed that the bilateral trade between Russia and China, which is to the tune of 90% of which today is being done in yuan and rubles. Then again between Iran and China. So there is no problem in doing their local currency trade. The problem comes with India here once again. And the problem is it was disclosed by the Russian ambassador in Delhi, Mr. Denis Elipov. He said during his interaction that the Indian banks, the problem is not in the payment between rupee and ruble, it is the Indian banks which are worried about American secondary sanctions. Now, if India is worried about that, then obviously there are other countries also which do not want to rush and unnecessarily annoy the Americans. They want to go very slowly, they want to make progress. So I think this is where the things lie. And as far as the trade is concerned, The best thing right now is to do it in national currencies as told by President Putin. To the bilateral which was held between India and China, you see, it was about mutual trust. In my understanding, I've done a video on this. Now, somebody rightly tells me that what is mutual trust? Can you define that? Well, mutual trust is fundamentally about national interests. Because if you have an interest, a national interest in something, then you make an effort to build mutual trust. Now, when the Indians have decided that we want to align ourselves with the Americans, and we have seen that after the Galwan killings of June 2020, so many formal agreements the Modi government has signed with America. So that is where its national interest lies. That is where it is getting the technology from. That is where the hardware is coming from. It is not coming from the other side, the other governance model that I spoke about. So I do not see this mutual trust building because the national interest is not there of India. A decision has been taken. Basically, a decision has been taken to pull out from that foundational RIC collaboration. That is the big thing which has been done. So the government can keep talking that, look, the relations are still not normal because there are still trouble on the line of actual control. See, this is just a sideshow. The key thing is what I have explained. Now, the question then comes is, if the mutual trust is not being built and both sides are talking of strategic communications and they are talking of SR, the two special representatives meeting up soon, so they can go through the motions in my estimation. I'll be surprised if something to the contrary happens. If the two countries work together, I'll be most happy. If India and China actually work together, which I don't see happening as far as the Modi government is concerned. So the question is, why did Prime Minister Modi in the first place go to the summit in Kazan? Now, there are many reasons for that, why he went there. For example, India has strategic relations with Russia. So Modi could not have said no to an invitation from President Putin. Number two, Putin has been a peacemaker right through Prime Minister Modi's last 10 years between India and China. Now, it would not be appropriate for Modi and for India that he goes there, the host is Putin, who's been a peacemaker, and India does not have a formal interaction with Xi Jinping. The Chinese are keen because Chinese want to go back to that foundation. Again, let me just make this point here itself. Why the Chinese are keen is because Chinese and the Russians, they want to go back to the original spirit of RIC triangle because that will help stabilize the global geopolitics, which is right now in turbulence, faster. That is the reason why they are keen. They are not keen really. I mean, China is looking at the Indian market, but it is more than that, looking at the stabilization. Because after all, if you see in terms of trade, today the biggest trade China is doing is with ASEAN countries. Then number two is the EU nations. India is not in that category. But coming back to what I was talking, so that is could be the second reason. Then another reason is that India has already declared that it is the leader of global south. You see, this is the spirit. When you talk of a leader, you are talking about a zero-sum game. But this spirit does not exist in this. The governance model that I spoke about, where you have these two great powers supporting this model, China and Russia. So, and then India also wants to be a bridge between the global north and global south. I don't know if the global north really wants India to be a bridge to the global north. So the point I'm making is, in my understanding, it is good that the two countries spoke at the highest level after 5 years, but I do not see mutual trust building because India has decided to have its national interest with the Americans with their model. Thank you very much.